My name is Evelyn Hart, I'm 32, and the morning my mother told me I was no longer a consideration in my parents' estate, I felt something inside me go very still, like a lake before a storm. Because in my family, pain is never screamed, it's catered. The chandeliers in the East Hall were already lit against a sky the color of polished nickel, rain misting the limestone the way donors mist praise across a press release. And I walked up the wet cobbles of Hart House with my heartbeat counting seconds, not memories, because memories here are expensive and always come with an invoice. The door opened before my knuckles could touch it. This house anticipates you, or it forgets you on purpose. And a maid I didn't recognize led me not to my old room, but to the small guest suite off the north corridor, which is how our family says you are still here, but you are not of here. My mother, Margaret, crossed the foyer as if the marble had been poured to match her spine, pearls hinged at her throat like a verdict, posture sharpened to a weapon. And she didn't hug me, she didn't look at my face long enough to mistake me for someone with feelings. She just said, "You're late," although I was early, and the syllables slid across the floor like glass. My father had been dead 6 days, a heart attack with the grace of a scheduled landing, and grief at Hart House had already been reduced to itinerary. Arrivals, flowers, donors, optics, the right music at the right volume. So I stood where daughters stand and gave the approved words while my mother measured the economy of my sorrow and found it insufficient. Because sincerity here has a dress code I have never once worn. My brother Charles arrived last in loafers that never scuffed, the kind of man who treats affection like an allowance and calls it leadership. And he clapped my shoulder with the practiced ease of a coach benching a player to teach a lesson she already learned. "Evie," he said, the childhood nickname curled on a leash. And I remembered the rainy afternoon when I beat him at chess, and he overturned the board with a smile, pieces skittering across the Persian rug until Mother lifted one palm and said, "We don't gloat. We correct," and somehow correction never applied to him. The dinner on the eve of the wool reading was staged like an exhibit, silver domes, crystal stems thin as thread, place cards that put me far left as if grief could be quarantined. And as servers lifted cloches in a choreography of deference, Mother's fork kept time for the conversation, memorial timing, donor optics. The board's tenderness to narrative, and then, calm as weather, she set her wine down, eyes still on the stem, and said, "We finalized your father's will last month. Whitmore will read it in the morning." A beat, a glance at Charles, and then to me, "We've all made choices, Evelyn," which in heart means. You left the family firm to fund art programs for kids whose parents don't have seats at galas. You refused to lend your face to the fundraiser that scrubbed reputations cleaner than the money that paid for it. You chose a kind of value that doesn't photograph well. Corridors whispered that night the way seas breathe around ships, and in the soft seam where doors inhale I caught 3 words not meant for me. Rewrote, timing, Whitmore, and sleep became a negotiation I lost. At 8 the next morning, the elevator at Whitmore and Ames sighed open onto carpeting so thick you could hide a secret in the pile. Reception smiling like a courtroom before a sentence. A bowl of lemons in the conference room glinting under a skylight like a private joke, and we took our places. Mother at the head, Charles at her right, me at her left, but down a seat. Elise Hare, the CFO, opposite, grief folded into her blazer pocket like linen. Mr. Whitmore, tall and careful with a tie the color of ironed law, a junior associate with eyes that missed nothing, and a clock that ticked as if time was billing by the minute. The reading began like a march, clauses in order, legacies annotated, trusts enumerated with metronomic calm, until the clean blade arrived. To my son, Charles, I bequeathed the entirety of my residuary estate, inclusive of the primary residence, secondary and vacation properties, vehicles, art holdings, and the voting shares of Hart Industries previously held in my name. To my wife, Margaret, the lifetime income interest in the Marlowe Trust, a precise pause, and then, my daughter, Evelyn. Silence, the kind designed to look like good manners, is not named as a beneficiary under this will. I didn't blink. The HVAC held its breath. Mother didn't smile, which is how she does smile. Charles exhaled like a man whose training montage finally paid off, and I met my own pulse and told it to lower its voice. Then Whitmore, whose calm is reinforced steel, rested one hand on a leather folio at his right and said, not loud but decisive, "There is one final instrument to be read into the record," and the CFO's pen hovered while the associate's breath caught. Whitmore opened the folio with the care you give to live things and produced a sealed envelope the color of attic letters. My name written in my father's right-leaning hand that signed permission slips and corrected my long division. And Mother said, "Daniel." softly, dangerously, firing a warning across a room to a man no longer available for warnings. Whitmore slid a silver opener under the flap, rip. The small tear sounded like a violin string climbing into tune, and he read, Evie, if you're hearing this, daylight will say I betrayed you and night will call it prudence. We argued over the difference. Your mother believes legacy must be seen, you believe it must be felt. I have loved you both poorly and with good intentions. The will satisfies appearances which you have never needed. What you need cannot be cut out on paper, discretion and control. Years ago, before the board taught me how fear votes, I placed controlling interest of Hart Industries into a silent trust insulated from probate and public record. You are the beneficiary and controlling trustee. You cannot be disinherited from what is not in the will. If you are angry, be angry with me in private. If you are grateful, be grateful to the 15-year-old who asked me why our drivers never saw their kids' school plays. This is not a weapon, it is a responsibility. Use it to make the company into the story you tried to tell me in the kitchen when I said art wasn't practical. I was wrong. Art is the only practical thing. Whitmore set the letter down as if too much pressure might smear ink into apology, and the room came back online, clock, throat, chair creak, the cold lift of air over skin, while Mother's fingers whitened on the chair arm, pearls settling against bone like a verdict. She said no in a voice reserved for locked-door boardrooms, the syllable that had strangled 1,000 yesies in their cribs, while Charles leaned forward, knuckles pale. What is this performance? And Whitmore, serene in the way men backed by paper can be, drew out a second stack. The Hart Family Silent Trust, tabs patient, paper thick, executed 8 years ago, amended 4, restated 2. The trust owns Series B super voting shares through Hart Parent Holdings LLC, representing 51% of total voting power. Ms. Hart is the sole trustee with fiduciary prohibitions. The trust's existence was sealed pending Mr. Hart's death. Notice to the board is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon, and he placed 3 notarized affidavits like chess pieces that had already seen the endgame. I was 12, then 25, then exactly 32, and all my ages looked at me and nodded. Sit up. You will not humiliate this family, my mother said to the table, to the ceiling, to her reflection, and I told her quietly, I won't. Because humiliation is loud, and what I had was quieter than shame and sharper than applause. Charles scoffed, You don't even want this. You ran away to hand out paintbrushes. And I let his script die on the table and said to Whitmore, Continue, so he did. A sealed letter to the board chair, a memorandum of governance reforms he and I had argued about across 3 Christmases, a note to Elise in my father's fast legal pad hand, You will be heard under her. Make sure she hears what I wouldn't, and I saw a light behind Elise's eyes that didn't belong to grief. The hour became logistics, where to sign, who to notify, how to set a meeting where no one could pretend they hadn't been told. And when we rose, Whitmore cleared his throat and said to me, eyes on tabs as if they needed a place to land, Your father asked me to say something you wouldn't want to hear from him, and my mother's head tilted, hunting, and Whitmore said, He was proud. And then he fixed a post-it like a lid on a jar so the words wouldn't leak. Marble felt colder on the way out, my own heels sounded different when I knew my destination, and outside the rain decided to be endorsement rather than warning. At 1:57, I entered the boardroom with Elise on my right and Whitmore on my left, and a row of directors arranged by appetite and education. And the chair, a woman made of straight lines and long memory, called to order, invited Whitmore to read the trust notice into the minutes. And the air moved, but no one gasped because real power hates noise. I didn't lecture, I did the only thing my father's letter demanded. I made this a responsibility. In 10 pages and 8 minutes, I laid out 3 moves, metrics that matched reality: on time, in full, safe, humane, procurement that treated money as a tool, not a trophy, no more cozy vendor contracts, transparent bids with service-level teeth, and a workforce schedule that stopped treating human sleep like scrap, route rationalization, 2-week posted schedules, no more 3 a.m. surprises, misnamed flexibility. And I promised a 4th move that would outlast my name. Right into the bylaws, a 1% of net to community arts and technical training, because creative minds in our warehouses become operational minds in our boardrooms when someone funds the hinge. There were questions disguised as invitations to back down, 3 frowns that were habits rather than thoughts, and 1 director, Jorg, who speaks seldom and only to cut fog, saying, surprising but not illogical. which in that room is a standing ovation. At 2:31, the chair entertained a motion to acknowledge the trust. A second followed like a respectful echo, and the vote crept forward 3 ayes quickly, 2 after a glance at Elise, 1 reluctant eye, 1 abstention from a man who likes to be asked twice, and the notice entered the minutes like a quiet birth. At 2:45, my phone hummed with a text from Charles. "You stole what Dad wanted for me," and I watched the letters rearrange into what they always were. Someone else's script for my life, flipped the phone face down, and walked to the driver's break room because if I was going to carry a company, I wanted to feel its weight where it actually lived. If you're wondering whether my mother accepted it, the answer arrived at 4:04 when Whitmore received a courtesy copy of an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order to enjoin the trust notice. Filed by counsel retained that afternoon by Margaret Hart in her capacity as surviving spouse and interested party. And for 30 minutes the game moved to a courtroom without a jury, late-day calendar. A judge with diction like a scalpel, and one question. Had my father executed an instrument with required formalities and competent intent? Hardwick Whitmore's bulldog in a better suit presented affidavits from 2 notaries and the independent trustee who drafted the amendments, plus a contemporaneous memo in my father's hand referencing a board vote from the same month, fear votes. The company should not, and the judge read it twice without changing expression. Mother's counsel argued undue influence by a daughter estranged from the family enterprise, and Hardwick asked, "Is philanthropy estrangement?" Then pointed to 8 years of trust existence predating any dust-up and 4 amendments aligned with company performance slumps, a pattern the law respects. The TRO was denied with a line I will have framed. "The court will not substitute inheritance theater for trust law," and the corridor oxygen turned breathable. I didn't celebrate. Permission to proceed is not victory, it's obligation with a green light. The next morning at 5:15 a.m. I stood in the warehouse with coffee hot enough to hurt, boots from my internship pinching in a way that felt like honesty, hair tied back like a decision, and I told the night crew coming off shift what we were doing in words not polished by comms. Your jobs are safe, your ideas are necessary, your time is not disposable. If anyone says otherwise, give them my number, and I wrote it in marker on the whiteboard big while 2 guys laughed until they realized I meant it. We implemented week 1 changes that didn't care about optics, route rationalization, kill the overtime lottery, start a compliance board with actual dock workers on it, and I sat in break rooms listening to the real map. Which docks stick in humidity, which customers lie in RFPS, which supervisors have become sponges for everyone else's mess. Elise translated when the language shifted from pain to process, and I said you're right more than anything else because they were. My mother came once that week, late afternoon when machines hum instead of roar, wearing a high-vis vest like a borrowed costume, paused at the safety board where new green ticks outnumbered old yellow warnings, and said to my shoulder, "You're making a spectacle." And I looked at the schedule posted 2 weeks ahead and said, "I'm making a system," and she left the way she wins, without evidence, full of certainty. The first month bled because turnarounds due, old vendor contracts had to be unwound without starving the patient. A supervisor quit by leaving his badge on a keyboard like a shrug. 2 customers tested us with impossible windows and we said no with time-stamped alternatives. The second month held 7% fuel burn drop, on time up from 83 to 94, OSHA incidents down, driver turnover decelerating. And I slept 4 uninterrupted hours on a Tuesday like it was gold. The bank sent a note that wasn't congratulations but confidence. Proceed, the only applause money gives. In the 3rd month, we executed the clause my father hid for me like a key under a stone. A golden vote trigger embedded in Hart Parent Holdings that allowed the trustee to replace 2 directors if quarterly service metrics fell below an agreed floor 2 quarters running. When Whitmore read that line in a governance session, the air changed. A room built on family suddenly understood that family had been translated into accountability. Charles tried one more maneuver, a shareholder letter accusing me of mission drift and impracticalities disguised as compassion. And Elise, who had indulged 10 years of that voice, printed the letter, attached 9 pages of numbers, wrote, "Practicality is a function of outcomes," copied the board and the bank, and the letter dissolved under math like sugar in tea. You want cinema, the sharp envelope, the gasp? 2 weeks after the TRO failed, we returned to Whitmore's conference room for housekeeping, and he produced one more sealed envelope I didn't know existed, wax unbroken, to be opened if Margaret contests the trust. my father's handwriting formal as a verdict. Whitmore asked permission with his eyes. I nodded. Inside was not money or more shares but proof. An ethics memo unsigned, prepared by outside counsel 18 months earlier documenting attempts by interested parties to pressure him into moving company assets into a marital trust to avoid mission vagaries. A memo my father refused to act on publicly because he hated scandal more than sin, and beside it a short letter to my mother. Margaret, the company is not a sun, it is not a mirror, it is a set of obligations. I have failed to say this out loud because I preferred peace to truth. Consider this my out loud. D. Whitmore slid the documents to her counsel with the neutrality of a man handing over weather. And there was no explosion, just the quiet of a balloon deciding to be a sheet of rubber. In the corridor, my mother said, "You've embarrassed us." And I answered with the spine of my new life. "I've employed people and kept promises on paper. If that embarrasses you, that belongs to you." And I left before we could circle back to a script written when I was 12. Months turned into rhythm. The first quarterly call where our worst customer said like clockwork without irony. The Tuesday a driver named Giorgio told me he could make his kids bedtime because his route stopped being a choose-your-own adventure. The day facilities replaced the last broken bathroom lock, and I signed the work order with a satisfaction no gala could buy. I kept my father's letter in a drawer with spare batteries and a roll of good tape, practical company for a memory I refused to glamorize. And on nights when the building slept, I'd reread the line that hurt and helped, "Be angry at me in private," and let the anger burn clean and brief like alcohol. The last time my mother and I occupied the same room at Hart House, she stood beneath my grandfather's portrait, hat in hand, sun in his grin, a stain on his cuff he never let anyone scrub out, and said to the air, "We did it," plural as armor. And when she turned her head I saw, just for a second, the girl she had been, the one who wanted someone to say she was more than the most elegant answer in any room. "Don't let them soften you," she said, almost kind, and I realized it was the closest thing to a blessing I'd ever get. "I won't. Softness isn't the risk, porousness is. I can be kind without leaking." If this finds you in a corridor where a voice you love is telling you you're less, listen for the other voice, the one written in ink you haven't opened yet. My parents cut me out of their will publicly, theatrically, and for a breath it felt like erasure, but in a room with lemons and a man who irons his ties, I learned the dead can still whisper. And sometimes their whisper isn't a ghost story at all, it's governance. And if this hit somewhere true, tell me where you're watching from, like and subscribe for more tight, suspense-driven stories about standing your ground when family crosses the line. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the finest revenge isn't a scream. It's a signature in the right place and a system that keeps working when the room is empty.